Hi, Meghna. Welcome to Wild Women Interviews.
Hi, Janki, and thanks so much for having me.
So to introduce Meghna Krishnadas, she describes herself as an ecologist at large. She left a career in medicine for ecology. She works at the Laboratory for Conservation of Endangered Species at the Center for Cellular and Molecular Biology, CCMB, in Hyderabad. So just a couple of quick questions for you, Meghna. Who or what do you draw your inspiration from?
Oh gosh, you start with a tough one. I don't know. I haven't been one for idolizing ever. So I don't think I have this one person or thing that I hold up as an inspiration. But I think I'm just constantly looking towards how do I live a simpler, better life? Maybe that's the way I want to go for it. While admitting that the life I have at the moment may not be the best way to live that life. So I'm sorry, I'm not able to answer that question quite satisfactorily, but then I've never been given to idolization.
Yeah, I thought you would say like a particular forest and, where you did your field work or something like that.
Oh, that way. Well, that way, I think just life around us, right? There's just so much. If you keep your eyes and your ears open and your mind open, there's just so much around us to see. But often, the lives that we live today as modern human beings in our societies, it's just so human centric, and we close ourselves into these trivialities of everyday life. So I think my inspiration is let's break out of that. Let's see the world for what it is. We have a beautiful world around us.
Okay. So what's your favorite place in the world?
Well, I don't know. That's also hard to tell. I love mountains in general, whether it's mountains with forest or high altitude mountains. But then I love spending time by the sea and just watching things. So I think at this moment, I would say that my favorite place in the world is probably in a place in the Western Ghats. It is called Bisle. It is near Pushpagiri Wildlife Sanctuary. And perhaps purely for personal reasons, because we've been going there for a while and we're really thinking that we might want to, at some point, have a patch of land there and move there. So perhaps that. But yeah, otherwise it's hard. I would think that it's so unfair to any other place in the world if I call anything my favorite place.
So you were a medical doctor first. So what made you change careers? I mean, I can see the similarities. You go from the health of human beings to health of forests. So it's not that divergent, but it's still on the face of it, two completely different careers. So was there a crucial moment that led to that?
Well, first of all, I think the way you describe it in terms of moving from the health of human beings to health of forest is probably the first time anyone has said that to me, but I have always thought of it like that myself. So just wanted to highlight that. Thank you for understanding that about the way I moved. No, I don't think there was ever one crucial point. I think it happened. I often say that where I am, I reached because I meandered freely for some time, and not because I had a set path to go on. So it just accidentally happened that when I was in medical college, when I joined medical college, I think I realized that this isn't quite what I want to do. And I couldn't articulate it myself at that time, but I knew that I wasn't really happy doing this or looking at life, the rest of my life doing this in some sense, or at least the way medicine was practiced as we are taught in our colleges, and the kind of goals you're supposed to set for yourself, the objectives you're supposed to meet in life. It so happened that I went to BR Hills with my friends completely casually, probably the first time I've gone to a forest with the idea of just watching a forest. And I completely fell in love with the experience there. And I think I just sort of sought out more such experiences. And then I volunteered with some organizations. And I think, to cut a long story short, it just so happened that it was something that naturally appealed to me. And when I got a chance, a very lucky chance to experience this possibility of doing these kind of things, I tried to take more and more of those chances. And eventually I decided I wanted to move full time. So it took a while.
Yeah, so you study forest ecosystems and diversity in
Mhm.
particular. So in your studies, what would you say are the factors that promote biodiversity?
Mhm. Well, the factors that promote biodiversity is actually a very large question. And in some sense, this is the essence of what many ecologists do. And particularly in my field, which is community ecology, which is that I don't study one single species, but I study how multiple species live together. How do they come together to form a community? How do they coexist with one another? And while I study these phenomena or these questions with respect to plants or trees in particular, you can ask the same questions of other communities of organisms, like butterflies are communities, or you have insects as general as a community, beetle communities. You can define your community. So the question of biodiversity is really very much a question of scale. Like you can look at biodiversity in one small patch of a place and say, why is this patch so diverse, or what is maintaining the diversity in this patch? Or you can look at biodiversity at the scale of an entire ecosystem. Like why is a rainforest more diverse than a dry forest or a desert? Or from like region to region. So there are historical evolutionary processes that have led to the patterns of diversity that we see today. I don't look at those, but what I look at is the ecological processes that are maintaining or allowing diversity to be maintained in one place, or have more diversity in one place as opposed to another place. So when we come down to plants with that question, specifically, I look at what are the effects of environmental conditions like light, water, soil nutrients, or temperature in driving which species survive in which place. Why does one species do better in place A versus place B? And therefore, what kind of community are we likely to see in place A, which is, let's say, warm and dry, versus place B, which is cool and humid, or something like that, as an example. But I also study biodiversity in terms of interactions, like how species interact with one another and through other organisms that eat them, plants, things that eat plant species. So herbivores, insects, pathogens. So in ecologist terms, I would say abiotic and biotic conditions are what I study.
Okay, so when I think, I think a large number of people, when we think of biodiversity, we think of rainforests as having the most biodiverse range of plants and birds and all other life forms. Why is that? Why are rainforests the epitome of biodiversity?
Yeah, you're right, Janki. I mean, I think when you think biodiversity, it is probably a lush rainforest that comes to mind. Partly because it has been advertised. There's a rainforest is a mysterious place. So there's a lot of there are a lot of stories about the diversity of rainforest, but also because it is actually correct, right? Like rainforests do harbor immense diversity or various different types of plants and animals. And like I said, part of that reason is probably historical, like the evolutionary processes that have shaped where rainforests are, which for a long time have probably been cool, moist, humid, which means the climatic conditions have been relatively benign, which means that not too many species are under stress to survive a particular harsh climate. And so many more species can evolve. If you have a stable system, then you have these interactions and you have evolution taking place such that many species can evolve. And as there are more and more interactions, you also have more and more kinds of species coming up. An example would be the interaction between, let's say, plants and their insects, right? You can have an arms race where a plant develops a certain defense against a certain insect, but then and so this insect may not be able to eat it, but then that insect needs to evolve to a new organism such that it is now able to eat this plant. So we have these processes that are sort of put in place over evolutionary time, which has happened a lot in rainforests. And that's probably why we see a lot of diversity. And in general, even today, I think it's because partly to do with climate, that you have this warm, humid, benign climate that allows a lot of different species to persist without too much stress on them. They don't need severe physiological adaptations like you would need in a desert or a cold tundra to survive those conditions. And also because there are lots and lots of biological interactions that have evolved, and that maintains all the diversity. Like,
Yeah, sorry.
for example, animals that eat fruits and disperse their seeds, animals that eat seedlings or eat seeds. So all of these kinds of interactions actually help maintain plant diversity.
Okay, so you were talking about warm, humid, and high rainfall areas promoting growth. But if you, in a way, the rainfall itself in rainforest is pretty extreme, like, the desert is another extreme. So it seems to me like if you think moderation is, best offers the best of both worlds, a warmer, drier area would offer
some intermediate
condition.
condition.
That's what logically I tend to think, but that's not reality. Why is that?
Yeah, that's interesting because, and there's nothing wrong with that logic. It can be that extremely high rainfall areas have their own set of stresses. So when I say that, it wouldn't be correct to say that there are no stressors in the rainforest, but by and large, it appears that a more stable climate, which is not fluctuating too much from either day to day or from month to month over a long time frame, is conducive to many more species evolving, and therefore more interactions evolving among species, and hence biodiversity over the longer term. And that's what has happened in many rainforests. So there is, in ecology, there's this hypothesis, where we sort of, it's called the intermediate disturbance hypothesis, which now has been debunked as a zombie hypothesis. So, and that in some sense says what you are saying, right? Like, but in the context of disturbance, like if you constantly disturb something, you allow species, little bits of disturbance can allow species to persist that wouldn't otherwise be in that system. But if you disturb it a lot, and then you just go towards those extremely disturbance tolerant species. So then what you see is that the most diversity happens at some intermediate disturbance. And so I think what you're thinking of may be similar to that. But again, I would like to reiterate that ecologically, like in terms of ecological theory, this hypothesis does not hold anymore. We know that this is not the way the world works. It has been debunked. But no, I think the diversity of rainforests, it's just that the high rainfall that we see, it's not like a flood. Over time, what has evolved is that this high rainfall is what is sustaining the system at a very stable state, allowing the system to be in, be at a pace where things are not under undue duress to change their strategy, evolutionarily speaking. So yeah, I think that's why the rainforests are still the more benign conditions. That said, when you go into a rainforest, the fact that there is, it's wet, which means that you have a lot of pathogens and you have to handle all of those. And again, I start speaking from the perspective of plants, and do excuse me for that, but I look at the world as a plant would like to look at it, I suppose. So you have to have, so species differ in their ability to tolerate these kinds of pathogens, but you also have very little light coming down to the forest floor, so there's intense competition among all the plants to make sure that they get whatever light is available. So there are stressors, but these stressors are not the ones that are allowing or breaking down diversity from happening. They're actually promoting diversity. This kind of competition allows different kinds of species to persist. And there is very, very fine scale differences among species, because that is possible. They can differentiate themselves at very fine scale, because at a larger scale, the climate is just, benign, and it's allowing them to stay, within a certain range in a fairly stable manner. Versus when you go to a desert, you have these fluctuations during the day, you have absolutely no water available. So you have to have that physiological adaptation where you can survive that extreme low water condition. Nothing else matters. So the only species that survive are the ones that can develop something like this. And only once that filter is passed, you can have other things evolving. So there's not much scope there.
You know, you were talking about the competition for light, for instance, and sunlight is a hard currency in the rainforest. So, you know, I remember reading about it in the many years ago, like one giant tree falls down, and in that little gap, a zillion seedlings come in trying to make it. So if that is exactly what happens on a forest edge. Like there's lots of sunlight and it also gets the rain. So you'd expect this explosion of plant life, since we are talking plant. But your studies don't actually show that, right? It's not really as diverse as you would expect it to be. Why is that?
Right. Yeah, so, and you're absolutely right that in some sense we can characterize the creation of, like, the breaking apart of a large forest into smaller chunks, and therefore the creation of forest edges, in some sense, like flipping the coin of what would happen, or flipping the situation of what would happen in an intact forest. So in an intact forest, you have this large chunk of forest with very little light coming in, and there are these little holes in the forest where a tree has fallen and the light is pouring through, right? But when you fragment a forest, you're just sort of flipping that dynamics, where the amount of light now available is much larger. So even in gaps, forest gaps, what we have seen is that not all species can exploit gaps. Now, because light is such a hard currency, like you mentioned in the rainforest, most plant species have actually evolved to survive in very low light conditions. But that comes at a cost. It also means that many species that do really well in low light, like in deep shade, they can't actually change their physiology suddenly to use high light conditions. There are a whole set of species which we call light loving species, you know, and I, of course, there are gradients. I speak very broadly, just for a simple generalization, and it's these light loving species that end up dominating or doing really well in these gaps, right? So if you just look at you know, if you just look at the a proper, like an intact forest, many of these light loving species can't survive anywhere else. They can only survive because these gaps are created. But as a whole, in the entire forest, you have both light loving and shade loving species able to coexist at that larger scale because there are these tiny, tiny gaps. But now when you flip the equation and you have lots and lots of light, it's the shade loving species that don't have enough space to survive. And most of the areas are now taken up by these light loving species, which by the, you know, by their nature are really fast growing. They utilize light really quickly. That's the reason why they can't survive in shade, because they need that light to constantly grow. Otherwise, they just sort of die off with pathogens and whatnot. They're not well defended. So like I said, there are these trade-offs. So yeah, when you fragment a forest, what happens is at the edge or near edges where there's high light, it becomes increasingly dominated by these species that are more, that do better with high light conditions. And that's been the traditional point of view which sort of was taken from what we knew of gap dynamics in
Have we lost you, Meghna? Can anyone else hear her?
No, I can't hear her.
I think her internet went. There you are.
Oh, yes.
We lost you.
I don't know why. Yeah, my connection seemed fine, but I realized that, I mean, I could hear you say that you lost me. I could hear everything that you were saying. Sorry, I'm not sure where I stopped, but yeah, basically when when there's lots of light, you have only one kind of, or few kinds of species doing well in those high light conditions. It's not that, evolution has worked in such a way that it's not like all species can do well just because there's more light and the conditions are better. Because rainforests are shaded in general, it's actually shade tolerant species that do well in an intact forest, and they lose out when there is a high light condition.
Okay, so if I
which is why you're not going to see as much diversity. You'll just see a subset of species doing better at the forest edge.
Yeah, so if I understand right, so if you have all these plant predators. They could be insects or pathogens or fungi or whatever that keep a control on plant numbers. So they don't allow one species to dominate over other species. But yet you do have particular species that are gregarious, that grow in great numbers in one patch. So have they somehow solved the mystery of how to get ahead in life or evolution?
No, well, yeah, I suppose one could say that. But so one thing is, even when we look at these pests and pathogens, we need to understand that usually this this action of theirs of being able to keep down the numbers of more abundant species, and we don't really mean numbers. What we mean is, in technical terms, it would be the population growth rate. So if you have two species growing, their populations growing at a certain rate, the one that's growing faster is the one that needs to be cut back down more, so that both of them can sort of come to the same level and coexist together, right? Otherwise, this one that's growing fast will over time just sort of take over the entire system. Now, what these pathogens do actually, and is they cut back the population growth rate of this faster growing species more than the slower growing species. Am I sort of clear? I'm trying to get in some nuance here, but I also think that because it's fascinating, and this primarily happens if pathogens have what we call a kind of host specific effect, which means that if I have pathogen A, that should have, preferentially attack species 1, and pathogen B attacks species 2. So what happens when species 1 is growing really fast is that its pathogen is also growing really, really rapidly, exploding along with it. And so it keeps cutting it back down. So then no one species can completely dominate, and both species will sort of stay in the system. And sometimes there's like this cycling over longer time frames. Whenever something goes up, its pathogen brings it down, and so on and so forth. So that's how pathogens actually work. It's or in rainforest, that's how they're assumed to kind of work. And but what happens is some species, like you said, they become hyper dominant, and that there are two things. One is it just might be a measurement factor, that we as humans go out and measure things at very small time scales, and what we are seeing is just like a blip. It's not really that species has solved the mystery of how to be dominant. But there are certain phenomena that allow some species to just explode in numbers. And for example, there are actually in Agumbe, I don't know if, I'm sure you've traveled to Agumbe, the rainforest that is there in the Western Ghats. And there you will see there's a species called Poeciloneuron, where there are just stands of Poeciloneuron. You see the species everywhere. And similar things happen with other Dipterocarpus species in Borneo, for example, like in the Asian tropics. So what scientists have found is that sometimes this happens because they are associating with mutualistic fungi. So they form these symbiotic associations with, say, arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi. Maybe some of you have heard the term mycorrhizae. So when you build these associations, sometimes what happens is it leads to a positive feedback. Now what happens is the more of your kind is there, the more mycorrhizae you can harness, and the more of your kind you have. So sometimes at local scales or at very large scales, you have these species that are doing extremely well.
Yeah, I was thinking of neuron when I was talking about gregarious stands. Yes.
Okay. Yeah, interesting.
Yeah. So
there are other species also that do that. There's a lot of interesting study on mycorrhizae and how they can promote tropical forest monodominance, because otherwise it's so rare in tropical forest, right? You don't see this, like many of one species aggregating at a place.
Okay, so the other aspect of your studies is like you're looking at the size of seeds, for instance, whether why do some trees produce huge seeds and some produce microscopic seeds, and how does that play into the whole ability to survive in a forest that seems to be full of pathogens and things that are out to get you?
Great question. Yeah. So in more general terms, what you outlined is, that you've brought up the point that plant species, and not just plants, actually, even if you take birds or butterflies, anything that you take, different species differ in their inherent characteristics. And these characteristics are relevant to them being able to withstand different kinds of stressors, for example, or use resources differently. So we call them, ecologists call these features as traits. So seed size, like you mentioned, is a trait, and species can go from small seeded to extremely large giant seeds. Now the question is, why is there so much of a difference? Because small seeds give you a very different advantage in life compared to a very large seed. But you can't do both at the same time. So
Like
when you
what
are
kind
small,
of
you
advantage?
produce.
Sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to come to that. So take a very tiny seed, like a ficus, for example, or I don't know if you're familiar with the Western Ghats. There's a species called makaranga, which produces lots and lots of seeds. But when you have a tiny seed, you're actually not investing that much in each seed. Each seed is not that great in terms of supporting the seedling that will come out of it. But the advantage of these tiny seeds are that usually it is eaten by lots of animals, and they take it far, like, ficus can be eaten by so many different birds, and then they can take it to very many different places. And large quantities of these seeds can move and occupy all of these spaces that are potentially available for a seedling to come up, right? So the advantage of being a tiny seed is that you produce lots and lots of seeds. So imagine that there are two species, each produces about 100 kg of seeds. If we take that as the baseline, the large seeded species can maybe only produce, say, 1,000 seeds, whereas the smaller seeded species can produce 100,000 seeds. Correct? So now you have 100,000 possible sites in a forest that this seed can land in, compared to just 1,000 sites for the larger seeded species. So there is a trade-off. The small seeded species is trying to win sites, literally. That's what it is called. There is an ecological term for it. It's called competition colonization trade-off. So which means that if you can colonize lots and lots of sites, you aren't that great at competing for those sites, because there's not much in that seed that allows you to hang in there and compete if there is competition. The large seeded plant, on the other hand, it's not going to go and arrive at a whole lot of different sites, but wherever it lands, it's probably much better equipped to withstand any other competition, establish there, and be able to live through that part. And some of these things can be with relation to light. For example, we have seen that in rainforests, many of these smaller seeded species are actually not very good at tolerating shaded conditions. So these are the ones that do well at, say, gaps or edges or conditions where the light is more. And that's because there isn't much seed resource, right? So the moment the seedling comes up, you need lots of light so that it can grow and photosynthesize. The large seeded species, even if it puts out the seedling and it doesn't get light, it has quite a lot of carbohydrates and nutrients left in the seed for it to keep going for a while, until it sort of establishes itself, puts its roots in, and slowly develops a sort of capacity to photosynthesize from whatever light is available. So they're kind of competing, but they're trying to maximize their gain along different dimensions. So similarly, we have found that some small seeded species or many small seeded species are actually more prone to attacks by pathogens as well. Again, because they don't have the resources to withstand. And we have also seen, interestingly, with respect to traits, that when you have small seeds, that's also associated with certain other traits like thin, cheap leaves, which actually are good for photosynthesis when you have a lot of light, but they make you prone to pathogens and herbivores because they are so thin and not well defended. The large seeded species, on the other hand, sometimes produces these thick leaves, or oftentimes produces these thick leaves, which are better defended against pathogens. So what we are seeing, these traits, the reason why we study traits is because it tells us these general life history strategies that species are having. And this is regardless of species, right? Like what I study in a forest in India, saying that a small seeded species responds in such a way to pathogens versus a large seeded species can very well be applicable in the Americas, the neotropics, because there also we have pathogens and we have small seeds, and we try to look at more generalizable relationships across the world.
Wow, we are almost at the end of the time allotted Do Abhinaya or Atira have any questions?
Atira, hi.
I guess we have to wrap up.
Hey,
Sorry, go on.
I do have a small question.
Go on.
Yeah. Hi, Meghna. Hi,
Hi.
Janki.
Hi.
Great discussion. Lovely to hear talk about this. Actually, one of the, when you were talking about this, the life history strategies is something that I was thinking about, and also another linked thing. How linked is dispersal to I mean to these features? Because in some sense, I mean, you have species where seeds are, I mean, they are, regenerate in a clumped or a scattered manner, and stuff like that. So how does that feed in to these patterns that you see?
Yeah, very relevant to the question of differences in seed size. Now, smaller seeded species, like I said, the reason why they can colonize so many different sites is because they're actually better dispersers as such. Or rather, that they're eaten by lots of animals or dispersers, and then they go to many different sites. So this can also be termed as a dispersal colonization trade-off or whatever. Dispersal competition trade-off as well. Yeah, and larger seeded species, not too many animals can eat it. Limitation is just the seed size itself. And so many of them tend to fall very close to the parent, and very few of them actually move away from the parent. So yes, generally larger seeded species tend to disperse lesser, and they depend on these few long distance dispersal events, like by hornbills or by animals like tapirs and peccaries in neotropics. Does that answer your question?
Thanks so much, Meghna and Abhinaya and Atira, for joining us. Bye. Thank you so much.
Is there time
Bye.
for a
Thanks,
small
Janki.
question?
Thanks, Janki. Had a great time. Thanks.